Hello and welcome to the Your Financial Pharmacist Real Estate Investing Podcast, a show all about empowering pharmacists to achieve financial freedom through real estate investing. I'm Nate Hedrick, and each week, my co-host David Bright and I explore stories from pharmacists all over the country who are achieving their real estate goals while maintaining a meaningful career in pharmacy. Whether you're a first-time investor or a seasoned pro, we're here to provide education and inspiration about the world of real estate. Please note, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks. How you doing, man?
Good. We're busy. It's the start of the buying season over here, so it's been fun. We've been looking for more houses to buy this year and trying to ramp things up with what's kind of a weird market right now. So.
Yeah, I'm curious with your realtor hat on. I know it's, beginning of the year and all that stuff. Are you seeing buyers that are starting to be on the hunt a little more, or what are you seeing?
I'm seeing more price reductions than, we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years. And what that means is that there's actually room to negotiate. I was just talking to an agent that I work with through the concierge service way out in California even. And he said, it's finally fun again to be a real estate agent. Like we can actually help our clients negotiate instead of just having a money fight with 10 other buyers. It's actually nice. I like it.
Yeah, it's not like, can we get in there within the first 3 hours and offer 10 or 20% over ask? Yeah, it's...
Especially if you're savvy, right? What I've been trying to do with a couple of my buyers recently is find properties that are on the market between 20 and 45 days. Something that says, hey, this might be overpriced, but there may not be anything wrong with it. It's just a matter of it kind of got overlooked because it wasn't the right number or whatever. And going into those properties and offering on them in ways that we couldn't before. And we've been able to start creating some deals. So it's been, again, it's more fun than it's been the last 2 years for me.
No, that's good. And I think that, kind of increased inventory, the fewer bidding wars, potentially lower prices, it does seem like I'm hearing more and more people that are thinking about a primary residence move where they may have been scared by how hot the market was a couple of years ago. It's now like, well, maybe it's time to upgrade in house or to move to a different part of town or something like that. And I know it came up as a question recently that there's this default belief that when you move to a new primary residence, you have to sell your old house. But what about keeping that old house? What about hanging on to that and then doing something with it from an investment standpoint? It certainly can be one of the easiest ways to get into real estate investing, but there's a lot of detail there, right? To make sure that that's not a bad move, that that's a helpful move, that it's a good investment move.
Yeah. And there's, like you said, it's a pretty healthy debate because there's different schools of thought, right? Am I able to purchase a new house without selling my old house and getting the equity back out because I can't afford it? Or are the interest rates making it to where that doesn't make any sense? Or, is it something that I want to be a landlord for? And I think, you and I got tagged in a debate on LinkedIn not that long ago. And again, we just thought that there's a lot to discuss here. And so it might be a fun episode for us to unpack.
Yeah. And good to unpack because of there's not a one size fits all answer to that, right?
Definitely.
Like not every primary residence would make a good rental property. And sometimes there's pretty significant tax implications, or maybe the loan is a major factor in one way or another. Like you said, maybe it's impacting your debt to income ratio to the point where you can't qualify for a new house unless you sell your old house. Or maybe it's such an advantageous interest rate that by keeping that and using that as a rental property, you have a once in a blue moon kind of opportunity for really strong cash flow on a property. So lots of details that go into that. And so it's probably a good thing to unpack, to put some context behind that so that answer we always give of it depends, right? We can start to put some reason behind and help people work through that it depends.
Yeah, absolutely. So because there's so much to unpack, I thought, when we were talking about this beforehand, we said, let's break this down into kind of two main parts. And so part one will be kind of talking about the types of investing strategies that might work well with a primary residence. And then part two will be more about the hidden factors, like things to look for, taxes, types of loans, what should not be forgotten when making a decision about what to do with that primary residence. So we'll look at some of those different pieces in two parts.
Yeah, when we start out with the investing strategies, that part of it, we've had several folks in the podcast that talk about different ways to invest, and we really have a list of 3 key approaches from a primary residence standpoint when you're leveraging your primary residence as a avenue for investing. So the first one is house hacking, right? Where you buy a property that's larger than you need personally and you rent out the extra space, whether that's extra bedrooms, maybe you're buying a duplex and renting out the other side of it, something like that. Second avenue is a live-in flip, where you buy a fixer upper, but instead of going there after work and working on it or however you would do that, you live there and you live in your own construction zone and flip it that way. And then the third one is buying a house with an intention of keeping it as a rental property after you move out, where you know that it's a good rental property, you will live in it for a while and then keep it eventually. So just for context, we should probably unpack each of those at least briefly. So Nate, could you start off with house hacking? Because I know you've said time and time again that you wish you would have done that.
Yeah, absolutely. So house hacking, again, at its core level, is simply buying a property in which you are going to rent out some of that property to somebody else to help cover a lot of your costs. Typically, that's done by buying a duplex, a triplex, quad, living in one unit and renting out the others. But we've seen people do it all different kinds of ways, right? Renting out a couple of bedrooms. We had Corey Sanders from Hawaii back on episode 80, on episode 85. And she talked about how they did a little bit of construction work to make their property a little more duplex friendly. And there are a lot of different options for how you can achieve that. But the sole idea is using the fact that you're not the only person living there to make the overall costs of living there as low as possible. And sometimes you can even get it to the extreme where the costs are being paid by the other people in your home are enough to completely offset your housing expenses entirely, which is huge.
Yeah. And I like how you said that, for you, it may not have been a good fit for the season of life you were in, right? Because I think that there's a season of life thing, and just by getting into house hacking doesn't mean that you need to stay there for the next 30 years that you would be in that house, right? I had a couple times when I was in college where I rented from a friend that bought a house and did that. And he just rented out the bedrooms and I rented one of the bedrooms from the friend. And so that worked in the college season, but that wasn't a fit for those folks long term, right? So you can always shift gears over time and you don't have to house hack for the rest of your life if you start there. That may be for a season of life that makes sense.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the downsides, right? Like I said, I wish I would have known about it, but still, it may not have been the right fit at the time. It may not be a fit for everybody, right? If you've got a new baby or a new dog at home, right, and you're worrying about the neighbor's dogs and keeping somebody up and thin walls or whatever, there are a ton of reasons why you might not want to live on top of somebody else. And that can be one of the downsides that I think a lot of people perceive. But again, there are also a lot of creative ways to set that up where you're not dealing with those downsides. I think it's just a matter of the type of property and where you're located. That can be making a big difference in that.
Yep, absolutely.
So, okay, if that's house hacking, David, what is the live-in flip? I know we've talked a little bit about this, and I know you've actually done this a couple of times yourself. So walk us through that one.
Yeah, I really like this strategy because I am, as we've said before, very limited in my handiness, right? Like I can push a paint roller around and that's about it. But, we were able to, a couple of times, my wife and I were able to find houses that were not pretty. And because they weren't pretty, they were not selling. And so we were able to make a lower offer and get a cheaper house. In doing that, they required a lot of paint. We had to hire contractors and have some other work done. But by doing that, we were able to buy houses cheaper. We were able to put some sweat equity into it, have some contractors in there, and then customize the house how we wanted it, which we really appreciated. So it wasn't just buying a finished house that someone else finished to their preferences. We were able to do that. And we were able to do it guilt-free for the most part, because we were taking something that was really bad and then making it just how we wanted it. So in doing that, not only was it for us at the time, but it also improved the value so that when we went to sell that house, we've improved the value and then could walk away with some profit in the process.
And I feel like this one, hearing you talking about it, it requires a little bit more planning than even the house hack or what many people go into a primary residence purchase with the mindset of just, does this house work for me? Something like a live-in flip, and even the next one we're going to talk about in a moment, it requires planning in advance, right? You've got to buy that property at a low value. You've got to buy something that needs a bit of work, something where you can force the equity into it. This isn't something where you can just buy any property and call it a live-in flip because you did some rehab, right? That's not always the case. So a little more planning required for this to work for everybody, but I still think it's a valid option when you're looking at, if we're going to buy a primary residence and we're not always going to live in that house, what are our plans down the road? And that could be very, very part of that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because just because you go in and you paint a room doesn't mean that
Hmm.
that actually changed the value of the property,
Right.
right? Like there's a lot of things that could be done to a house that may not. And so that's where having a really good realtor on your team to help you with what are those value adds and what are those value neutral and what are those things that you may do that you think are improving or maybe improving for you, but are actually reducing the value of the property. So yes, a lot of planning that goes into that. And like you said, there's also a lot of planning that goes into the third strategy, which is buying a house with the intentionality that would be a rental property someday. So, Nate, do you want to walk us through that one?
Yeah, I have a lot of clients that come to me with this idea of I want to buy my first house and I want it to be a quote unquote starter house. And then when I move out, I want to keep it and rent it. And that to really have that work, you either need to get very lucky, right? By just buying it. And then when you go to move out, it happens to be a good rental. Or more likely, you planned ahead, right? So you're actually looking at that property as if it were an investment property and you just choose to live there for a certain amount of time. And so, what I advise my clients to do is to run the numbers on that house like it were any other investment property, where it was not going to be your primary residence and you had to rent it out today. So that if the numbers work now and the numbers work when you move out, it's always going to be an investment rather than just guessing when you get to the end. So, again, when we talk about prep work, we talk about going in on this. You can't just assume that you can keep the house and rent it out. I'll tell you, the house I live in today, we love it. Like we've been in this house for almost 10 years now. We're on 2 awesome acres of land. It's perfect for us, but it would be a terrible rental property, right? The amount of work required to maintain this house is not something that a tenant would want to take on. And it's not something I, as a property manager, want to do. I can barely cut my own grass, let alone cut my grass when somebody is living here. That's not me, right? So there are properties that are not good rental properties. You can't just buy it and assume that when you move out, it's going to work, right? You really have to plan ahead.
Yeah, and that may be very limiting then for that house, which again I think speaks to that season of life. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you're considering, well, maybe I'm just going to rent a house for a while, or maybe I'm going to buy a house that would intentionally be a rental. Maybe when you start to compare that apples to apples, then maybe it's a similar move. But you're right. If you're looking kind of for that forever home, there's a good chance that forever home may not be a good rental. So a lot of intentionality up front that goes into that.
And there are ways you can make this, again, even if you don't want to do that intense work up front, there are ways you can start to mitigate this, right? Where you can look at it from the perspective of, okay, this house has a new roof and has a new driveway, a new garage, new whatever. So the capital expenditures on this house are very, very low. So even if I do move out and rent it out, I really just need to cover repairs, mortgage, taxes, and then we're good, right? It'll still cash flow because I know all these things are new and I can get another 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years out of it, right? So there are ways to kind of hedge a bit on that if you don't want to do the full analysis. But again, the best way to go into that, if that's your plan, is to run the full investment property analysis up front before ever making a decision.
Yeah, I love it. So those three strategies, then they can all make sense depending on your goals, depending on your market. So for instance, if you don't really want to own rental properties, but you just enjoy taking something that's ugly and making it beautiful and that's fun for you, then maybe the live and flip is a good thing for that kind of guilt-free improvement. On the other hand, if you're looking to acquire rentals, then maybe there's some real advantage to living in the property for a while and acquiring it with the intention of it being a rental.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, if the goal is to acquire more rental properties or whatever your goal is, right, there might be some hidden advantages to living in that property up front before converting it into a rental, right? That can be a strategy as part of your desire to acquire multiple rental properties. So David, we talked about this a little bit before we hit record, but maybe you can help us break down, some of those things for us.
Yeah, and really the two things that we thought are really key, that where there can be some benefit when you live in that house first before it becomes a rental, or there can be some tax advantages, and then there can be some advantages when it comes to loans.
Hmm.
So if we start with the tax side of things, right? So preface that, Nate, neither you or I are accountants or lawyers or anything like that. So this is another reminder that you need a good team around you. You need a good CPA and other folks that understand the tax side of things. But
Definitely.
I think the general concept, so that you can ask questions of those professionals, is there's a Section 121 exclusion, which means that if you live in the house personally for 2 out of the last 5 years and you sell that property for a gain, then you don't pay taxes on that gain as long as the gain is no more than, I think right now it's like 250,000 if you live there and are single, 500,000 if you're married. So there's more nuance there. Like make sure you check with your tax advisor before doing this. But again, the general concept, if you live in that house for a while, you can flip that house and not pay taxes on the gain. Again, if you live there for at least 2 of the last 5 years.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. That there's a couple key aspects of that rule that deserve double emphasis, right? So one is that 2 in 5 year rule. So if you're planning to flip a house quickly in a year or less, or 6 months or 3, this doesn't really apply. So you have to keep that in mind. Even if you move into it, flip it for 3 months and then move out, that doesn't. It has to be 2 of the last 5 years. So that's super important. The other thing is that if you make substantial improvements and then move out and convert that house to a rental and rent it out for 4 years, let's say, then you haven't lived there for 2 of the last 5, right? So there's a sweet spot where that can go the other direction, right? Even if you live there for 10 years and then rented it for 4, you haven't lived there 2 of the last 5. So don't mess up on the front end by moving out too fast, and don't mess up on the back end by renting it out for too long, if that's the way you're going to go.
Yeah. And if we look at a tangible example there. So my wife and I did this, as you mentioned, with our first house. We bought it, we fixed it up, and then there was a gain, partially because of fixing it up and partially because the market was improving at that point in time. So we sold it. The gains were far less than $500,000 limit, right? So there was no tax implication for us. But the second house that we did this in, there were tax implications because we lived in it for only just a little over a year. And so in that case, the decision to sell and we converted it into a rental and then sold it. But for that decision, that was more of just an investment decision. And also we just wanted to be in a different house and start our kids in a different school district. So it was all, not every decision needs to be rooted in the tax considerations, but if all else is equal and you're trying to think through different strategies, it can be really helpful to brainstorm that through with someone that understands the tax side of things, because a tax-free gain when you go to sell a house can be quite a substantial benefit.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned something else too earlier, David, that I think is super important, and that's the types of loans that you can get to do this as well. I think there's a common misunderstanding that if you buy a primary residence with an owner-occupant mortgage and then you move out, the thought I get, or the question I get a lot is, well, then I have to refinance it, right? Because I'm not living in it, so I need to go get an investor loan. And for the large majority of homeowners, that's not the case at all. You can actually very frequently keep your owner-occupant mortgage in place with the original loan terms and everything, and still convert it to a rental without any sort of penalties or the lender coming after you. Nobody's calling you up to see if you still live there. You have to meet the requirements for certain types of loans to live there for a certain amount of time. But once you've hit those boxes, you don't have to worry about converting it to some other type of mortgage down the road.
No, definitely. That is a huge benefit that we should not overlook, because quite frequently those mortgage rates, they're what, like 100 basis points sometimes, meaning 1% lower in rate for an owner occupant versus an investor. So as we look at rates today, and so we're recording this in January 2023. I think that I looked earlier today, and 30-year interest rates were sitting around 6.25. Mm-hmm. So 6.25 becomes 7.25 if you don't live there. It can become higher if it's a duplex, if it's a cash out. There are other things that can cause that rate to go higher and higher. And so if you intend to occupy it personally and you live there, that lower rate can be really substantial when it comes to calculating the cash flow of a rental property. In addition, you're oftentimes putting down 20 or 25% for an investment property, but maybe 10% if it's a vacation rental, but you may be able to buy a personal residence for 5% or 3.5% or 0% down in some cases. And so not only does the monthly payment side improve with the interest rate shift, but your ability to buy that property just with saving up a down payment can be substantially easier if you choose to live there before converting it into a rental.
Yeah, and that reminds me of just why house hacking, for example, to go back, is such a great concept. You can buy a larger house than you need or multiple units, leverage the money from the bank, right? You can really start to leverage that other people's money and still get great terms on that loan, which is really hard to do otherwise. And so that's just such a cool concept to really not game the system, but to use the system to your advantage and still have a great place to live.
Yeah, and same kind of thing with the live and flip. If you're going to flip the house and you are, like me, not able to put in your own furnace and other things like that, right? Like you need to have money for that. And so if you're able to get the property for less down, then any savings that you have can go towards those improvements as well. So it can be much more feasible to do some sort of live and flip through that small down payment of a owner occupant mortgage versus trying to get a 25% down on an investment mortgage.
Yeah, obviously the downside there is the living in the construction zone. I feel
Oh,
like that's the
yes.
one reason we've never taken on the live and flip personally. But beyond that, yes, I completely agree. I mean, if you can buy a house with a great owner occupant loan, fix it up, enjoy it for a couple of years, and then sell it with that exclusion, like what an awesome win. I mean, that's a great way to do it.
Yeah, and again, combining those strategies, maybe you're doing the same kind of thing. You're putting a very low down payment, you're fixing it up, you move out, you keep it as a rental for a while, and then, like you said, that selling it on the back end, you rent it out for a couple of years and then sell it.
Mhm.
You could continue to do that and create some tax-free gains along the way.
Yeah. All right. So coming full circle, I mean, we got to this discussion because of exactly these types of scenarios, a debate about what to do when someone moves out. Should they keep it as a rental, sell it, keep the gain? There's so many different options out there. And I think a lot of it, again, stealing our Tim Baker line, like it depends. It depends on if you set yourself up for this. It depends on what your goals are when you're moving out of the current property and what your goals are with your life, whether you want to be a landlord or whether you want to just move on. There's so many variables at play.
Yeah, and I think that those variables, hopefully, we've given some context that can make sense for some of those. But it goes a lot into that personal financial plan, your personal goals, even from if you set aside, well, maybe moving out and keeping that property as a rental isn't the greatest business move, but it just lets you try on for size how that feels to be a landlord and do I want to do this? Because it's probably that easiest time to buy a property when you don't have to go out and buy it. You just have to not sell your old house, right? So even if you're just thinking through, what do I have the appetite for? What do I have the stomach for? Can I do this? Is this something I'm interested in? That could be a time to do that. And yeah, thinking through all those variables can help try to figure all that out.
Yeah. I think back too, if you want to hear more about this, because I think there's a couple that I can think of that really exemplify how important that can be. Go back and listen to the episodes with Jenny and Mike. I know they were on really early on, and then episode 43, they came back. But Jenny and Mike talked a lot about the strategy of buying with great financing. They specifically use a VA loan for a lot of their financing. They live in the property for a while, then they move out and keep it as a rental, but they keep the fantastic loan terms that they established with. And so they've got some really cool examples of what that looks like in actual practice. So definitely check out those episodes.
Yeah, I love that example. And yeah, leveraging what was really advantageous for them to create great cash flow and great investment opportunities. I know for us, even though, like, as we've both talked, Nate, you and I both own rental properties. We love owning rental properties. But for me, I didn't want to own a rental property at a distance. And so when we moved from Ohio to Michigan, we sold that house. Even though that house might have made decent sense as a rental, we just didn't want to be landlords from a distance. So we were able to use the tax benefits because we had lived long enough to capture those gains tax free. Again, if you're thinking about that as an option, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to way back on episode 18. We had Amanda and Matt on CPAs that talked through some of those tax strategies. So just things to think about depending on what makes sense for you for a given property.
Awesome. Well, if you've got questions about this topic, or you've got questions about what to do with your property, or questions about something totally different, we'd love to hear from you guys. Again, this is how we get a lot of our deep dive episodes, is questions from listeners like yourselves. So if you could head on over to the YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group, post your question there. We'd love to debate with you guys about it, give you some ideas, strategies, ways to think through the question. You can find David and I on LinkedIn, or you can head on over to yfprealestate.com and you can reach out to us there as well. So we would love to hear from you guys, especially if you've got one of these questions that might be able to turn into a deep dive episode.
I love these case studies too, because even just throwing it out there on the Facebook group and getting some of those it depends answers, but it can not only help you to brainstorm, but it can help others that are watching alongside and just seeing all the different angles and different preferences. And so, yeah, throw that out there. I think it can be great discussion.
Well, hope you guys enjoyed that discussion. Hopefully it's helpful to somebody out there. And again, if you've got other ideas or other questions, we'd love to hear from you guys. All right, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.